All right. So today I'm going to be talking about um, a backend as a service product called Supabase and how you can use it with Flutter to build, products and services really quickly. I'm calling it a match made in heaven, kind of for fun. But I really do find that building out, whether it's a POC that you want to kind of, ship quickly and just kind of build, or you want to actually build a real business and a real product that you think is going to scale to a lot of users. I've been really enjoying playing around with Supabase, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about Supabase and a little bit how well it works with Flutter. So yeah, throughout this, if you want, you can use the hands up feature in Google Meet if you want to ask a question or type it into the chat. Feel free to interrupt me. I don't mind at all. So yeah, here we go. So first, I want to talk about Supabase a little bit. So Supabase is a backend as a service company and service. And there's a definition here from Cloudflare, and just in a short form, it's a software as a service model where the company provides you all the stuff that you normally need to think about for backend and let you just focus on the front end aspects of your service. So things like authentication, database management, backups, APIs, deployment containers, AWS, all that sort of stuff. The idea is that you just use one product that streamlines that for you, and you just focus on your product and more on your front end. So if we look at what that kind of looks like, your typical client server model is you have your client, right? That could be a website, it could be a desktop app, it could be a mobile app. You're interacting with your backend somehow, often with GraphQL or REST or some sort of data transfer model. You're usually consuming those requests in a web API. And if you're a front end developer, an app developer, that means that you might be working on like a .NET backend API. You might be working on a Node.js backend API, but it's a whole nother system and a whole nother code base that you got to learn, you got to get involved with, and you got to figure out how to get it into production. Um, and then there's the database, right? You have to figure out, are you going SQL, NoSQL, which flavor of NoSQL, which flavor of SQL. You need to have backups, you need to have replicas, all this sort of stuff if you really want to scale to a lot of users and make sure that your service is pretty robust. If you use a backend as a service company like Supabase or others, the model is a little bit different. You're typically much more focused on your client application. And instead of using, REST APIs or any sort of data transfer, you're typically just calling functions or accessing fields on an SDK in code that this vendor has given to you. So, from a Flutter perspective, what does this mean? It means that you're often just interacting with Dart code, right? You don't have to make HTTP requests. You don't have to learn a whole nother language and a whole nother system. You're just using an SDK that was given to you by this company and accessing your data and calling methods to make the same things happen as if you had all those downstream components. Um, so why would somebody want to use a setup like this? Why use Supabase or any other kind of vendor that gives you these capabilities? Well, it lets you focus on building things that your users see and interact with, right? The things that make your product different. Everybody has a database, everybody has a web API, but I'd much rather focus on what makes my product successful and different than others. And I don't think that anybody's going to subscribe to my service or not, whether I'm using a fancy database or a boring one or anything like that, right? Focus on your product, focus on your business, not your infrastructure. Additionally, those client libraries that I was talking about, it can be a lot faster to work with an SDK that's given to you rather than wiring up your backend to your front end, developing that backend, and doing all that infrastructure work that I talked about, right? There's a lot of work that goes into that. So if you can kind of abstract that all away, paying for a service like this, that can be a huge benefit for shipping products and features quickly. Um, but there's not only upsides, right? There's downsides to any choice like this. So why might you not want to use a backend as a service vendor like Supabase? Well, there is some aspect of vendor lock-in, right? I said you're using their SDK, which means that if you want to stop using that service, well, you probably have to make a lot of code changes. You might have to make architecture changes for how you've structured that application. You might be taking advantage of some really cool features that this service gives you. Um, but if you ever want to switch, if the pricing gets too expensive, if something doesn't work for you and you want to make a change, it can be tough. It can be challenging. Um, Talking about those features, flexibility is another area, right? Like, imagine you're building an application that has a lot of power users, right? Guys who are critical about performance. They really care about data usage. Let's say in a mobile app when you're out in the field. Well, let's say that as a feature, you want to update your data transfer protocol to use proto buffs or proto buffers instead of JSON, which is pretty standard for data transfer. Well, proto buffs can be a little bit more efficient, and so some people really like using them because it means you can use less data. Especially when you're using a metered data connection like LTE outside of Wi-Fi. That's not a change that would be easy to make if you're using a client library given to you by another company, right? That stuff's abstracted away from you. You often don't have access to the internals like that. So sometimes those specific use cases or specific things that if you controlled everything end to end yourself, you could change. You can if you're using a vendor like this. Which kind of goes into another idea of like, all of these vendors are building things to help people ship products, and they're building features and designing their SDKs in ways to match what products they think people are going to be building. But oftentimes that's just not the case, right? Like Supabase specifically, it gives you all these amazing rich client SDKs to use so that you don't have to work on APIs or you don't have to, connect all these different pieces together. But what if your API or your product involves exposing a public REST API? Right? Let's say Stripe, for example. Stripe has a public REST API that you can use to integrate with them. Well, if you wanted to build a product like that, you can't really get away from learning how to stand up a REST API and getting involved there. So all those kind of benefits where you just focus on your front end and you get to skip kind of these other components, well, that might not apply depending on your product specific use case. So those are some reasons why you might want to use a vendor like this or why you might not. If we take a quick look just on the common vendors that are out there, right? The most popular one, I think by far, is probably Google's Firebase, right? A lot of its features are free, not all of them. And there's great documentation for Firebase, and it works pretty well. It's been around for a while. Apple actually has one too. They only provide SDKs for iOS, but it's called CloudKit. Amazon has AWS Amplify, again, targeting the same sort of use case. Microsoft has one. There's another smaller company, Back for App, that does one, short for your back end for your app. And then Supabase is a newer one that's been getting a lot of traction over the last year. And there's a couple things specific and unique about Supabase that make me want to talk about it and kind of give talks like this. So Supabase is open source. Some of those other providers have open source components where like the client SDKs are open source, but maybe not the whole backend. Supabase is open source top to bottom, which means it's completely self-hostable as well. So, I kind of talked about pricing being one of the reasons that you might walk away from a vendor or make a change. Well, if you do get to a certain scale where you don't want to pay Supabase for service, you can go through the infrastructure work and host it yourself. And that might provide a good path from scrappy startup to actual company that's making money and wants to get efficient. It's built on top of Postgres. Postgres is a SQL database that is very well respected. It's been around in the industry for a long time. Has great features, so it's a great as a base for Supabase to kind of build on top of. And Supabase is simple and well documented, right? If you go through their guides, if you go on their website, there's tons of quick starter projects, guides for how to do different sort of things, like start up a user management application where somebody can log in, update their profile in Flutter, in Vue, in Next. So they're really accessible from a lot of different technologies, and all of those different technologies have like quick start guides. So I find that really, really good. And really, I think some of the secret sauce with Supabase is row level security. which gives you authorization at the data layer. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail soon because I know it's just a bunch of words that maybe don't mean anything without knowing a little bit more. So in a couple slides, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So, like I said, it's built on top of Postgres, and it's really great that it is. And it provides you a way to directly connect to Postgres. So, what does this mean? Well, I was talking about vendor lock-in, right? And it being really difficult to migrate if you do run into an issue with a vendor. Well, with Supabase, you could directly export your Postgres database, or you could directly connect to it and incrementally migrate. Because it's just a typical Postgres database and they let you connect to it directly, it kind of eases a lot of those vendor lock-in concerns. It gives you a clear path for getting out of Supabase if you really want to. Um, I talked about kind of the difference between a vendor or backend as a service setup and a typical client server setup. Well, this lets you pivot, right? If needed. It provides, like I said, a clear migration path, and it helps reduce that risk with vendor lock-in. Um, I'm talking about row level security a little bit. So it's a Postgres feature built into Postgres where users' data access is enforced at the database layer. Now, this is really important. Typically, well, you might have code in your API layer that checks different tables or checks your auth system to see who's allowed to access what data. Or maybe you haven't really taken into this account and access to your data is almost completely just done by front end and hiding buttons and UI, right? Which isn't great for security. So since the data and rules around data are built in the same place, are set in the same place, you can't expose data that you don't want to by accident. It makes it really hard to. A bug in the front end where you can click a button that you're not supposed to or something like that just won't be successful in the call to Supabase. Because all of that data reading, writing, and creating is protected by row level security. So let's take a look at some specific policies, row level security policies, and talk through them. So here's an example. So this is just SQL that you would write into your Postgres database, but it's not completely standard SQL because you're seeing this word policy here. So let me talk you through it. So imagine we're building a blog post website where, like medium.com, where users can sign up, post their own blogs, and comment on other people's blog posts. So we only want users to have full access to their own posts, right? We don't want anybody to be able to edit posts that they didn't author. So one way to do that would be to create a policy here, reading line by line on the first example. We're going to call this one allow all actions for blog authors on the post table. And what we're going to do is we're going to say for all here meaning delete, read, create, update, and then using, and basically what we're doing here is we're taking the user ID out of the authentication information that Supabase kind of injects into the database from the current user, and we're making sure that that equals the current user ID. So, or the user ID on the post table. So what this means is that if I'm the current user on a post, then I'm allowed to create, I'm allowed to select, I'm allowed to read, I'm allowed to delete. Um, Pretty simple. If I'm the owner of this post, I can do anything with it. Let's take a look at another policy. So this one would be allow any user to see all published blog posts. This is how Medium works, right? Like if you publish a post, then it's public on the site and anybody can go and navigate to it. If you share the link to somebody, they can read it. So how might we implement this? Well, let's create a policy on the post table again. And this time we're going to say for select using is published equals true. So is published is a column on post table. And we're saying that anybody is allowed to select it if is published equals true. And when you start kind of understanding how these policies are created, you start realizing how kind of insane it is that this isn't how authorization is done for all databases, because it's so easy to accidentally expose data or allow somebody to overwrite data just because of a bug in your code. So having it at the schema level, where it's included in backups, it's included in replicas, it's part of the data itself, really builds that protection in. A couple other short examples. So a blog website like Medium probably has comments. So let's see who is allowed to see comments. Let's see if we can create a policy for that. So we want to allow users to see comments on posts that they can also view. So one way to implement this would be to add a policy on the comment table. We're saying for select. So again, this is for reading only. If exists, select one from the post table where the post ID equals the comment ID. Okay, what's going on here? Well, we have the comment table, and the comment table has a foreign key to the post. So we know that comments belong to certain posts. And what we're saying here is if we're allowed to select that post, then I should also be able to see all comments on that post. So on the previous slide, we set up access to posts, and here we're kind of piggybacking on that access. We're saying, okay, as long as we can view a post, we can see all comments. This is really powerful because it means that I don't have to duplicate the lookup to post table and check if the post is published. Instead, I'm just seeing if I can select the post at all, which means if we want to change how the visibility of a post, we also change the visibility of a comment. For example, let's say if you wanted to do a delayed publish feature where the is published column would turn to true earlier than the date that it should be visible. And we update that policy here. I'll go back for a second, this second policy to take into account a date time column. And only if it's after that date time, we allow viewing. Well, because we're checking selection in this policy would automatically be updated to match. You would still only be able to see comments if the post is published and the time has passed. Really, really powerful stuff. You can do the same thing for create. And so the policy below is also really similar. If I can access the post, then I'm allowed to create a comment on the post. But we have an additional little check here. We say only if you're trying to insert a comment with the user ID that matches your user ID. This is important because we wouldn't want the front end to be allowed to set the user ID to anything in the world to somebody else's user ID. You wouldn't want to allow impersonation. And I think you'd be surprised on how many applications built with a current with a typical client server setup actually fall into this trap of not checking some of these relationships and just taking what the front end gives you. So again, bringing that data access as close as you can to the data layer is something that really, really helps for security and letting bugs like this through. So I think this is everything that I touched on. Since these rules are at the data layer, they're included in migration, backups, and etc. They're with your database. They're a part of your database. And Supabase actually has a little UI for editing these easily, and it shows you the SQL output. So as you're playing around with some common templates that they have, they kind of teach you about row-level security because it's a bit of a concept that not everybody's familiar with. So hopefully I made it clear here, but if not, I think that you'll find it really easy to learn as you play with the Supabase UI and editor. So let's talk about Flutter and Supabase together for a little bit. So far, we've just really talked about Supabase. So why do they work so well together? Why do I like building products with both of them? Well, they're both open source, and that's kind of table stakes for any modern service that developers love nowadays. But Flutter and Supabase both take the approach of having a big focus on the developer and the developer experience. Whether it's the quality of the documentation, the response on GitHub issues, or the community, creating content and trying to make it the best for everybody. I find that Supabase and Flutter both have that in common. There's a real focus on let's make sure the developer is our customer. Let's make sure they're happy, and let's make sure this is a joy to work with. And I don't feel like that's the case with older or every framework out there. And also, it's very much a batteries included kind of experience, right? Like with Flutter, you get the Material UI library, you get the Cupertino UI library, you get so much features built into the framework. You have a lot of first-party packages maintained by Google that really give you all the basics of what you need to build out a product. And Supabase is similar. We're going to be talking about some of their SDKs for Dart and Flutter soon. but they really provide you a great baseline to get started building a product where you have everything that you really need to get going. And one other bonus for the Supabase SDKs is they're all written in Dart top to bottom, which means that they're very portable. They work on iOS, Android, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and the web, 6 platforms. And if you compare that to something like the Firebase SDKs, where the Dart packages, just send their calls through platform channels down to the native Firebase SDKs. The problem is that those Firebase SDKs aren't as portable, right? They're harder to make work on multiple platforms because you have to port. You have to make sure that the Firebase SDKs themselves have support for the underlying platform, and that the Dart SDKs have made that bridge layer. So because Superbase's SDKs are Dart native, it really skips that whole problem. So let's do a bit of an SDK overview and take a look at some of their Dart and Flutter related features. So the Supabase Flutter SDK is broken down into modules, each supporting a core feature of Supabase. So Postgres Dart allows you from Dart code to interact with your Postgres database over a REST API. And that may sound a little bit concerning, right off the bat. I don't want my front end talking directly to my database. But again, remember, you're protecting all your tables with row level security. So we can kind of bypass that middleman, that API that you normally have to custom code, but still feel safe with our data access because we've used row level security to protect our data. Then there's the GoTrue Dart library for authentication. So that gives you your single sign-on with different providers. It lets you refresh tokens and implement authentication without needing to roll a custom solution. Real-time Dart lets you listen to changes in the database in real time and allows you to update your UI without, polling a REST API. What the real-time library does is that it maintains a WebSocket connection to the Supabase backend, and then as changes are being written to the database, you can define which ones you're interested in, and it will fire down those changes at your client so that you can build rich real-time experiences. And then storage, Dart is a Supabase part of the Supabase SDK, and it lets you store files like images, videos, or other binary large data that doesn't make sense to be stored in a database. And it's actually just a simple wrapper over S3. So if you use any sort of bucket storage like S3 today, it's a pretty similar model. So let's talk about these SDKs and look at some code examples. So let's talk about this one is for data access, the Postgres SDK. It's a really, really simple API, and I can almost cover, the complete basics in a single slide here. If you want to read from the users table, like that first example there, well, you just kind of type Dart code in a similar way to what you would do with SQL. So I'm saying I get an instance of my Supabase client. I'm saying from the users table, just select, and by default, if you don't pass anything to select, it's just a select star, and then execute. That'll make the network request. It'll go to the Supabase backend. It'll query the table. It'll make sure authorization lets you access what you can access, and it'll bring that response back down to the client where you can check for errors or access your data. You can also do updates. A pretty common thing would be changing one column at a time. So here's an example where, again, I'm saying accessing the users table. Maybe I want to change the status column to offline for a single user. So here I'm going to check that the username is what I'm expecting it to be, and I can execute that. And again, delete, really similar. Let's take the users table. Let's take a look at, call delete on that. Only when EQ for equal, only when this scenario is equal, so the username column matches, in this case, Supabot, and then I'm going to execute that. So a really simple API for accessing and modifying your data without having to write any backend at all. If we take a quick look at authentication, again, really, really simple. If you have an instance of your Supabase client, you can do something like client.auth.signin, pass in an email. Here we're passing in hello@toronto.meetup. your password that the current user has. They probably typed it into a form, and that would be it. That would start the sign in process. And if the information was correct, it would give you back an authentication token, which the Supabase client will use for data access and all those sort of requests. Um, you can also sign in, which is really really popular nowadays, with third party providers. Single sign on. That's built into the tool. Here you can do sign in with provider, pass a provider. There's 14 official third-party login providers out of the gate, which is a lot. You got GitHub, Twitter, Google, LinkedIn. Even some lesser known ones. I was looking at the list today to put that 14 number in, and there were some I didn't even recognize. So there's quite a lot of different SSO providers that you can set up, and deep links just straight back into your app, just like a typical OAuth sign-in would do. Real time. Again, pretty similar, pretty easy API. Let's say I wanted to print out real-time changes to the users table. Well, here I have my public schema. I'm accessing the users table. I would have had to set up real time ahead of coding this. And then on that users table's reference, I can listen to certain things and then print out the payload, which would tell me a little bit about what changed. So here you can see some examples for listening to everything, which that's star, or listening just to inserts, just to updates, just to deletes. So you can kind of dynamically control your UI. And you can subscribe and unsubscribe so that in certain parts of your application, you can listen to these real-time changes, and in other places you could shut down those subscriptions. Don't waste resources. So it lets you build really highly reactive real-time applications, like a chat application, for example. And lastly, storage, right? So avatars, images, or if you're building like an Instagram type app, you'll need to store those images somewhere. And again, the API that Supabase gives you is really, really simple and clean. Here we have an example text file at the first example, and we're saying client.from, in this case, our public S3 bucket, or our public bucket, I should say, storage bucket. And we're going to upload. We're going to provide a file name that will the file will be named that in the backend, and then a reference to that Dart file class. You can generate download URLs for these files in case maybe you're sharing them, or you're putting them in image control, and you want to make sure the image control when it shows on screen properly caches the image and shows it, if you're using something like Cache Network Image, for example. There's an example of how to download a text file or to remove a file or delete it from the storage bucket. So again, really, when you look at what I've shown today, that's really all the basics that you need to build a simple mobile app. And you can get all of that without needing to code all this up on the back end and do all that networking work and do all that auth work. Getting it out of the box really lets you move quickly. And so with that overview, I would say that one, I hope that you guys would agree that Supabase and Flutter together are a great development platform for rapidly building out products and features. And if you want to learn more about Supabase and Flutter, and you want to get started, there's a great example and guide to get started on the Supabase website, where it talks you through doing a basic login with either username and password or single sign-on, where you can update your username and update your avatar, which you can really use for the basics of any mobile app, right? Like almost every mobile app, you're going to at least log in and have a profile. So it's a great starting off point if you want to prototype your own app. Definitely recommend it. And that's really it for me. Any questions at all on what I talked about today, or Supabase and Flutter together? Don't be shy.
How is it different from Google Firebase? Why would you choose one over the other?
Yeah, really, really good question. There's a couple differences. One pretty big difference right off the bat is going to be if your data is better suited for a NoSQL style setup, you might be a bigger fan of Firebase since it's a NoSQL style data store. whereas Supabase is a SQL, standard SQL based data store.
But
Addition,
I don't
yeah.
really access the database myself, right? That's the whole idea.
Oh,
So
but you still have to interact with and store your data. So sometimes the type of database that you have can be better suited for more loosely structured data, like in a NoSQL world. And in a SQL world, you're typically a little bit more rigid with your data structure. You define tables and specific types and columns. Whereas with Firebase, it's more of a document store, so you just kind of like fire JSON on it, edit, and access it later. Um, One of the big things is that the whole Supabase platform is open source and self-hostable. So with Firebase, if your product takes off, maybe 2 years from now, the costs that Google has is too much, or they're raising the costs, and all of a sudden your balance sheets are changing completely. Well, if Supabase did that, you could self-host it yourself if you think that you could do it cheaper than what you were paying for Supabase. So that would be one reason. Um,
how about the Firebase? That will not allow me to get the data.
I think you could export the data, but you can't self-host the whole Firebase platform itself. Google is the only one who hosts that platform, so it would be a lot of work to move away from Firebase if it was getting expensive. Whereas with Supabase, you could just stand it up on your own infrastructure and then manage the costs as you see fit with your own infrastructure.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Um, There's other smaller things too. A lot of the feedback that I've gotten from people using I don't work for Supabase or anything like that. I do have a shirt. But some of the feedback I've gotten is that the SDK is a lot easier to work with because it's Dart native as well. I've talked to some folks who are building desktop apps. Firebase doesn't have the best support on desktop right now for Flutter, so that might be another small advantage to you. Um, yeah. How I got a question on the chat. How mature is Supabase on Flutter? Would you recommend using it in production? So the current SDK is not labeled as production ready. I believe they had checkboxes for early alpha, alpha, beta, and then production. And production's not checked off yet, but beta is. I would say if you can achieve what you want to ship with the Supabase SDK, it's very consistent and solid. So I wouldn't expect you to ship to production and then all of a sudden have issues. If you can achieve everything that you want to achieve, you test your product end to end and you're happy with it, I think that you'll be happy shipping that product to production. But it's definitely, I wouldn't call it mature, and it's really only gotten a lot of traction last year and this year, so it's pretty new. No worries. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. So thank you all for listening to me talk at you for a little while. I hope you got something out of it.